This is Tales from the Mess. I'm Amanda, and this is my mess. And every week I will try to make a dent in this mess while these critters make more and more mess for me to clean up. And in order to entertain myself while making a dent in the mess and hopefully entertain you, I will be retelling a fascinating or horrifying or mind-blowing true story. Sometimes it's true crime, sometimes it's science, but always it's fascinating and hopefully fun to listen to. So, let's get rid of this guy, get him settled down to do his homework, and start making a dent in this mess. All right, so the first part of the mess I'm going to tackle today is actually going to be folding laundry, which is something I am terrible at. Like, I'm fine with getting all the laundry done and washed, but then it ends up in baskets and bags and piles everywhere, not getting folded. So to do the laundry, to fold the laundry, I always clear a spot on the floor. And then I have these two, what do you call this thing? Tablecloths they're just made out of a fabric that doesn't hold pet hair. And so rather than actually have to clean the floor before I fold the laundry, I put these tablecloths down and I do the laundry folding while laying the laundry out on a tablecloth, because there are dogs and cats and kids, so the whole floor is covered in fur and crumbs all the time. So let's get started with the murder of Shelly Smith by Marcia Heald. The background. When I was in undergrad at Purdue, when I was a sophomore, so that would have been like 2002 time frame, I rented this apartment that was in a house that was like broken up into apartments in Lafayette, Indiana, and I would often walk my dog past this house on the corner of the block, and this house was gorgeous. I was obsessed with it. It was the most beautiful house that I had ever seen. I am still obsessed with this house, and it has been no short period of time since then. It's just the perfect house. If I could get the blueprints for it and, wasn't a nonprofit person, I would totally have a house like this, probably just like this, built for me and the family, because it's just my dream house. And here's a picture of it. This house is at 601 New York Street. At the time of the crime we're going to talk about, the address was 601 and a half because the house was broken up into apartments, and I don't think it is anymore. But just look at this house. I mean, I could go on and on about the windows, and I just love the Italian villa stucco over brick style. And just when you look at it on Google Street View, you can see that, like, it's so much different than all the other houses around it, in that they all have just boring, plain grass, open yards, and this one is surrounded by trees, and there's ivy growing everywhere, and there's that wrought iron fence. I just deeply loved this house. I swear, just seeing the house motivated me to try to do better in college, because I wanted to be able to live in a place like this. But the weird thing about the house was, I'm not folding my laundry. The weird thing about this house while I was in college was, I lived near it for a long time. I don't know, a year probably, and I never saw anyone going in or out. Like, it was very clearly uninhabited, but it did have a historic plaque. The historic plaque had no information whatsoever that was useful to me. So that's going to be my pajama stack. So no useful information. Then finally, one day, I'm walking by and I see this woman coming out of the house, and I get so excited, like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna find out some information about this house. So I stopped her and asked her, you know, like, hey, I really love this house and I would love to know more about it. She informed me that the house was owned by, I believe she said, the John Philip Sousa Foundation. And that it was the John Philip Sousa Museum. I want to say she said that. I've also read a ton of articles, so I just remember she mentioned John Philip Sousa and said that the nonprofit owned it. And then so I was like, great. And so I started looking up this nonprofit because I like John Philip Sousa anyway. I was a marching band geek in high school, and actually at the time I think I was doing marching band for ROTC too. Anyway, let's see, pajama pile, top drawer pile. Couldn't find any information about the John Philip Sousa Society, nothing. So I was never really able to find anything out about the John Philip Sousa Society or about the house, and I ended up moving into a different apartment and sort of forgetting about the house. I mean, never completely forgetting about it. I know I would see other sort of that Italian villa style houses in other places and sort of mention it to people like, oh, there used to be this house that I loved, but kind of forgot about it. And then super randomly, sometime last year, I was having a lot of trouble sleeping. That's a whole other story. Let's just say you got to be your own advocate when the doctors won't listen to you. I was having a lot of trouble sleeping because I was having severe side effects from a medication. And I was laying awake in the middle of the night one night and suddenly thought of this house just out of the blue, popped into my head. And I realized, you know, the internet's come a long way since 2002. I am gonna try to find that house, like on, you know, Zillow or one of the real estate websites, and see if I can find out more information about it. But of course, it's been years and years since then. I don't remember the address of the house. I do remember the address, the streets that I lived on and the street corner it was on, so I was able to find it on Google after a little bit of searching around. I can't remember if I hang this shirt up or if I put it in the drawer. So I did some searching around, found the house, still wasn't able to find much information about its ownership, but when I Googled the address of the house, when I finally found it out, I was astounded to find out that there had been this insane murder that took place in that house, and I had never heard of it, never heard anything about it. And when I had been looking into the house earlier in my life, that had not come up at all. So crazy. So I found this one article at that time when I was looking, and the article wasn't great, and I'm sure that it's one of the articles that I'm going to cite in my sources, but I can't remember which one. I just know it didn't give a lot of details, and I wanted more because the details of the murder that it did give were craziness, and I wanted to know more, but it was the middle of the night at that point in time, and I just couldn't find much. And then I decided to do this, Tales from the Mess, and what story should I do? I'm thinking, what story? And of course this one. And so I started looking into it, and my goodness, jackpot. I finally found a lot of information about this case. There's not a ton out there. It's weird because it sets Supreme Court precedent in Indiana. So from a legal perspective, like, it's a fairly well-known case. I'm still just shocked that people, you know, true crime aficionados like the Murderinos and other true crime fanatics don't seem to know much about it. It's just not covered. Like, it's not on Murderpedia, it's not on Wikipedia, although I may change that probably even before I post this video, so it might be on Wikipedia now. But whose paints are these? My kids are so close together in size, I can't tell just by looking at them whose pajama bottoms are whose. So I had to unfold them and check the size and now refold them. So that's how I found out about this murder. I'm still shocked more people don't know about it because it is weird as hell, and it has not changed my opinion of the house at all. Like, not positive or negative. I find the story fascinating. I find a lot of true crime fascinating, but it doesn't make me like want the house more. Probably because I couldn't have wanted the house more either way. So let's get started. I'm going to keep referencing over here. I got my notes on my computer because, you know, global pandemic, don't have a printer with ink in it right now. I do not like the glorification of killers. I don't understand, like, I get that the mental processes are fascinating, but it's just, I don't like the killers getting all the attention. In this particular case, this killer certainly didn't do it for attention, so I guess that's something, but there's not much information about the victim or the other individuals involved in this case. It's just really limited, and ultimately I was able to dig up the current locations of some of the family members, but it just didn't feel right. I'm not going to go into those details. There's a couple named Gerald and Shelly Smith that live in that house that I'm obsessed with at 601 and a half New York Street. It's 601 New York Street. Their address was 601 and a half New York Street, on the corner of New York and 6th in Lafayette, because it was divided up into apartments at this point in time. Interestingly, the historic marker was granted a month before this insane crime took place. So Gerald and Shelly Smith lived in this apartment at 601 New York Street, and they were friends with a gentleman named Brian Thornton, and they had invited Brian Thornton over for a little gathering at their house. Basically a lot of the articles call it a poetry reading, but other articles say it was just like a gathering of friends where they were discussing poetry. It doesn't really matter. They had some friends over, wasn't a big wild party. Poetry was apparently definitely a part of it. So they invite their friend Brian Thornton over. Brian Thornton is friends with a woman named Marcia Heald. Marcia Heald is not from Lafayette. The Smiths live in Lafayette. Thornton is from Lafayette. He knows Marcia Heald through a group that they both belong to that does 18th century reenactments. That was all the details I could find out about this group. It sounds to me like maybe like a society for anachronism, or like Renaissance festival-y kind of thing. They're things that I love, so I don't want to speak poorly of them, but like that's how they met each other. And so that's how he knows her, because she's not from Lafayette. She is from a different Indiana town called Plainfield, and she is a librarian for the Indiana State Library. So Brian Thornton invites Marcia Heald to this gathering that the Smiths are having, and the details in everything I read were a little foggy about what Marcia's relationship to the Smiths, and specifically the wife Shelly Smith, what Marcia's relationship to Shelly Smith was before this article. Shelly Smith's mom is the only one that gave a definitive answer of saying that before the night of this crime, Shelly Smith had never met Marcia Heald. However, some of the details from the investigation indicate that they may have met once or twice or known each other a little bit through their mutual friend, Brian Thornton. There's at least one account says that they had talked on the phone at least once or twice, which is really strange to me because, I mean, if they had never met, that just seems strange. But Marcia Heald definitely knew who Shelly Smith was because she and Brian Thornton had discussed Shelly Smith in the past. So, the night of the crime, the Smiths are having this get-together, and at about 8 p.m., Thornton and Marcia Heald, Brian Thornton and Marcia Heald, arrive at the Smiths' home at New York Street and attend this gathering. And by all accounts, it's a nice, pleasant little gathering, and they talk about poetry and whatnot. And then around 2 p.m., 10 p.m. So they're there for a couple hours, from about 8 to 10. Around 10 o'clock, Shelly and Marcia and Brian all go to Brian's house for a couple hours. So from about 10 to midnight, the three of them are all over at Brian's house. No details at all about that. I found myself falling down this like rabbit hole of curiosity, trying to figure out if, like, where the relationships went in this, if Marcia and Brian were a couple. One article referred to him as her boyfriend. None of the other ones said anything about any romantic entanglements at all. There's some sort of vague impression given that maybe Brian Thornton and Shelly Smith were in a relationship, but that could be sort of me reading too much into things just because Marcia didn't like the relationship. I mean, Shelly Smith was married. She'd been married, I think, for like 2 years to her husband Gerald at this point in time. So I don't really know what the relationship was there, but the three of them left the Smith's house and went to Brian Thornton's house from about 10 to midnight, and then Shelly and Marcia returned to Shelly Smith's house. Thornton stayed at his house and did not come with them. So at midnight, they come back to Shelly Smith's house. Near as I can tell, the party had broken up by that point. Gerald, her husband, Gerald Smith, Shelly's husband, was asleep. And the two women just sat and talked for a couple hours. At 2 a.m., Gerald Smith, Shelly's husband, woke up. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, Gerald Smith, Shelly Smith's husband, woke up to get ready for work. He found the two women in the living room just chatting away. And Shelly and Gerald offered to let Marcia sleep on the couch. They offered to let her stay, but she declined. She did not want to sleep on the couch. She went out to her car at that point in time. This sock did not come clean in the laundry. So Marcia Heald leaves the house. Shelly Smith goes to bed, and an hour or two later, around 3 or 4 a.m., Gerald Smith leaves for his job as a delivery person. So it's 3 or 4 in the morning. Gerald Smith leaves for his job as a delivery person. Shelly Smith is comfortably in bed, and when he leaves, he does not lock the door behind him. He closes the door, but he doesn't lock it. And I just need to say, lock your doors. It's important. Lock your doors, lock your windows. No matter how safe the area you are in feels to you, it's just the smart thing to do, because someone could have a psychotic break. So he leaves the door unlocked, goes to work. Sometime before 6 a.m., Marcia Heald, who is sleeping in her car outside the apartment, wakes up, and decides that she needs to go in and murder Shelly Smith for reasons that we will get into in frightening detail. She wakes up in her car. She goes into the Smith's house through the unlocked door. Around 6 a.m., Marcia Heald, or sometime before sometime before 6 a.m., Marcia Heald wakes up in her car and decides to carry out with her plan. She goes into the Smith's home through the unlocked front door, and she first goes to a downstairs bathroom where she strips off all of her clothes. From there, she heads to the Smith's kitchen, and in the Smith's kitchen, she retrieves a paring knife. For comparison, this tiny little thing that's like 6 inches long from handle to tip is a paring knife, to the best of my knowledge. That's what I've always called a paring knife. You know, I could be mistaken, the reports could be mistaken, I guess, but every article and the cases all said that she got a paring knife. So this tiny little thing, she got something like this out of the Smith's kitchen, and she goes up to where Shelly Smith is sleeping. She goes into Shelly Smith's bedroom and jumps on Shelly Smith, stabbing her while she shouts, "Yahweh's kingdom come." So she shouts when she stabs Shelly Smith in the neck with the paring knife and severs an artery in Shelly Smith's neck. Shelly Smith, not surprisingly, is terrified, jumps up, tries to fight Marcia off, tries to run away, and runs toward a bathroom. Marcia grabs her by the hair and drags her through the bathroom and into the hallway and throws her to the ground and begins to stab her in the head, neck, chest, and back out there in the hallway of the house. Oh my goodness, I have seriously been interrupted hundreds of times during trying to film this. Normally my kids couldn't care less that I exist, but at the moment, because I'm talking, I am the most interesting thing in the world. And I should point out, given the subject matter, they are in another room, and over the course of filming this have been doing a variety of different things, homework and watching stuff. They cannot hear the details of this case, but I do have to keep stopping when they come in because they can't hear the details of this case. It's awful and they're young. So anyway, Marcia stabs Shelly with the paring knife, severs her artery, drags her by the hair through the bathroom and out into the hallway. An arterial bleed is a big deal. I think most people know that, but it is the type of injury that one would bleed out from very, very quickly. And Shelly does. She loses she fights back as much as she can, but she loses consciousness quite quickly from the stab wound to her neck. Oh, actually, that's a pajama shirt. Yeah, so she loses consciousness quite quickly, and at that point is laying unconscious in the hallway. And Marcia Smith continues to stab her and also decides that she needs to behead her because she is under this delusion that Shelly Smith, and she tells the story a lot of different times. We get a lot of different reasons, but basically Shelly Smith is either like possessed by Satan, or she is an evil serpent, or she has an evil serpent inside of her. There's definitely something Marcia Heald is perceiving Shelly as somehow having this serpentness to her. She perceives her as having this serpentness to her, and it is her belief that she needs to behead the serpent because otherwise it will rejuvenate. So she's basically afraid that Shelly, because she believes that Shelly is a snake or a serpent, she's afraid that Shelly will rejuvenate, will come back to life if she is not decapitated. And this is where it gets even more sort of graphic and disturbing. So Marcia Heald planned to, in her words, behead or decapitate the serpent, the snake. Obviously, this isn't a serpent or a snake, it's a human being, it's Shelly Smith, and that is heartbreaking. And my shifting back and forth from the term to the term serpent or snake is not meant to dehumanize Shelly Smith in any way. My children very kindly went and brought me a whole bunch more clean laundry that needs to be folded and put away because they pulled it out of their drawers and closets and threw it on the floor. Normally I would have them fold it, but they thought that this would be helping me with my video. All right, so Marcia needs to decapitate the snake because she's afraid that Shelly will rejuvenate, that the snake will come back to life. The facts get a little dicey here between what is in the articles and what is in the court hearing or court paperwork. I tend to default to the court paperwork, but one of the issues here is the number of knives. So after the murder, the police collected somewhere in the vicinity of 5 knives in the immediate area of the murder, 5 knives that they believe were definitely used in the murder, but these aren't, all 5 are not referenced in the court paperwork, only 2 are referenced in the court paperwork, 2 at most, it might be just 1, and that is because there was some chain of custody issues and the evidence of some of those knives was excluded at trial. So the details are a little dicey here, but essentially the paring knife broke. Marcia went to the kitchen and got another knife. It seems like the next knife was a steak knife. She attempted to remove Shelly's head with the steak knife. And did not have a lot of success, and apparently during that process went through a few other knives, 5 knives total, in this attempt to remove Shelly's head, to behead the serpent. She also smashed a large potted plant on Shelly's face or head. And eventually she gave up on using the knives because they were not working for her, and she picked up a giant plate glass mirror and smashed that on the back of Shelly's neck. I say the back, I don't know, she smashed it on Shelly's neck, attempting to sever her neck that way. It shattered, and she then picked up a big broken chunk of glass and attempted to use that to continue to saw off the head, and was still unsuccessful. So she then proceeded to attempt to twist off the head, and still did not succeed. And as much as I want to fight against it, you know, I tend to have the same reaction as like My Favorite Murder, where I want to make a joke to lighten up the situation, and all I can think of in reading these descriptions after I move past my visceral horror is references to nearly headless Nick from the Harry Potter books. Please don't hate me for that. So this, my 5-year-old has been wearing his pajamas. It is actually my hospital gown from when I was very little and sat in a campfire. That's a story for another day, but I think we'll definitely get into that one. So anyway, back to the horror show. The last thing she tried to do was twist off the head, and it still did not work. And so I guess she just at this point assumed that she had done a good enough job and she could stop there. So she then goes back to that downstairs bathroom that she had originally been in, takes a nice shower. I don't know if it's long, but she takes a nice shower, gets herself dressed and ready for the day, then goes and, relaxes a bit. She makes several phone calls from the Smith's telephone. Remember, this is 1982, so landlines and long distance charges. She makes some long distance calls. 2 of those calls are to her sons, who are 14 and 17 years old. Her 14-year-old lives with his father in New Mexico, and again, this is taking place in Indiana. And the 17-year-old lives in Plainfield, which is where she's from. I don't know if he lived with her or not, but anyway, she makes 2 telephone calls to her sons immediately following this murder. And then she also wrote a letter. I don't know for certain if she wrote the letter while she was at the Smith's house or not, but the letter was to one of her sons, and the letter had incriminating details of the crime in it, and was later found in her purse. So after she commits the murder, uses the phone, uses the shower, eventually she leaves. She goes and gets in her car, and she goes to what most articles refer to as a well-known diner near Purdue University. But one of the articles stated that it was the XXX diner at Purdue. And I just throw that in there for, my other Purdue alumni and friends. XXX, I don't know if it's true. I don't know for certain that it was XXX. But it's sort of like a fun little hometown bit of factor there. So she goes and gets a meal, and after she eats, it's with my kids. They said these were clean clothes. This is not a clean shirt. I should have known better. This one I know is clean, because I made him change out of it. After she eats, she sort of drives vaguely around Lafayette, Indiana for a little while, and sometime around, I think they said it was around 9 o'clock, she realized that her hands were pretty badly damaged from the attack, particularly from using that shard of glass as a saw. So she went to the local hospital and got her hands stitched up. They took out several slivers of glass from her hands, stitched her hands up, bandaged her up, and then she went on her way again. The crime had not yet been reported, but it had, by the time she got to the hospital, it probably had recently been discovered, because at 8:30 a.m., Gerald Smith arrived home from work and, discovered this horrible, grisly scene at his home. So he immediately calls the police. If you want to read the case, or it might be from the newspaper clippings, we'll put all the citations below of where I got all my information. He does give a description of the scene that I just can't, and I'm not going to repeat because it's too much. He calls the police, and the police immediately come. And while the police were there at the house, Brian Thornton called the house asking to talk to Shelly. So at this point, the police said that they would like to talk to him. They had collected the names of everyone who was at the party. And when Brian Thornton called, they said they would like to talk to him. He agreed. They sent police over to pick him up and bring him to the police station for questioning. And it was then at the police station that Brian Thornton informed the police that he was aware that Shelly had this bizarre perception of him, that he was Christ reincarnated, and also, did I say Shelly? Marcia. Marcia had a bizarre perception of Brian Thornton that he was Christ, and also that Marcia was not a Lafayette resident, that she was from Plainfield nearby. So then while he was being interviewed by the police received information, presumably a neighbor called. They received information that Marcia was sleeping in the porch swing on the front porch of Brian Thornton's home. And she had arrived there around noon or shortly after noon looking for Brian Thornton, who she thought was Christ, and he wasn't home, so she just decided to, in broad daylight, go to sleep on his front porch swing, which is why I'm presuming one of his neighbors may have called the police. So the police find out she's there, and they go to pick her up. She's approached by a couple officers. They tell her that they're investigating a murder that took place at the house she had been at, and ask her to come with them. She agrees to go with them. At some point she asks if she's under arrest, and they said no, they just wanted to talk to her because they knew she was from out of town and they wanted to get her statement beforehand. And I'm pretty sure that was true. That's sort of what they were thinking until things progressed a little bit. So she gets in the police car, she goes with them, and initially she denies everything. She said that she had been at the Smiths' home until 2 a.m., but had no knowledge of a homicide. All right, so many interruptions, losing the light here. If it's not one thing, it is another. So, Marcia Heald has been picked up by police. She denies any knowledge of the homicide. She says that her hands are all cut up from falling down on the brick sidewalk outside the Smiths' residence. And there is a very beautiful brick sidewalk around the 601 New York Street property. But I don't think it's going to do the same kind of damage to your hands as trying to use a big ol' shard of glass as a saw to cut into a human. Eventually, some, what do you call them, what's the word I'm looking for? Hold on, it's here in my notes. The police become aware of some inconsistencies. I didn't even find it yet, but they notice some inconsistencies in her story. They ask her if they can search her handbag, her purse, and she says yes, and they find the letter that she had written to her son, which has some incriminating details in it. And eventually her whole story comes out, and she basically admits to the killing and gives some really bizarre reasoning and bizarre details that then come out in the trial. So next up, we are going to talk about the very crazy trials, the very crazy number of hearings about Marcia Heald and this murder of Shelly Smith. So I grabbed some hangers. I am going to run the clothes that need to go in drawers up and put them in everyone's dresser drawers, and then when I come back we will talk about the trial of Marcia Heald. So, little time jump there. You can probably see things got a little messy, because this is a real life video. I don't do any of the cleaning before the video or faking stuff. I can't stand that. I love videos where you get to see real people and their real messes, and that is definitely what you get to see here. So took a pause, and I ended up folding this over and made a whole mess of the neatly sorted laundry. But we're going to start back up now with the trial of Marcia Heald. So at her trial, Marcia Heald pleaded innocent by reason of insanity, and that is how the articles and everything put it. I find that a little strange because it's just not the typical legal term that's used in most places these days, but that's the term in my references, so that's the one I'm going to use. So she pled innocent by reason of insanity. Her attorneys did claim that she could not stand trial, but the judge found her competent to stand trial. There were 3 psychiatrists that testified. 2 of the 3 said that she was competent to stand trial. One of them said that she, quote, she is very intelligent, but she feels she is half human and half angel. She feels that she is a warrior type angel, and that she had to protect Thornton, whom she perceived as Christ, from the murder victim who Heald knew from a past life 5,000 years ago. That is what one of the psychiatrists said. And interestingly, I don't know from my notes if that was one of the ones that said she was competent to stand trial or the one who said she wasn't. But the judge and the 2 that said she was competent basically said, regardless of these beliefs that she had, she knew what she was doing when she committed her crime. And that was the central issue to whether or not she could stand trial. So at the trial, she presented a defense that she was insane at the time of the crime, and she presented a defense that she was insane at the time of the crime. This is the wrong child's clothes for this hanger. And I just want to list off a few of the things that Marcia Heald actually said during her trial. So, I don't think these are really in any particular order, but she was the first witness for the defense, and she began her testimony by claiming that her name was Mars, the god of war. And when she was asked how old she was, she stated that she was 5,743 years old, but 44 years old in her present form. And that age, that 5,743 very specific number, is a number with age progression that she repeated later in the appeals, near as I can tell. She also stated in response to, you hear my kids yelling at each other? My wonderful partner is in the other room keeping an eye on them, but it sounds like they're in disagreement about a game they're playing. Charming. So they had to move her trial from Lafayette to a nearby city called Lebanon because they didn't think she could get a fair trial in Lafayette. And in response to that, at her trial, Marcia said, "It was written 2,500 years ago. It would be at Lebanon. It is Yahweh's will. Human beings have no knowledge of my world. They shouldn't meddle. I am not a human being. I am an animal. I became an animal in March." And I should point out, March is not when the crime was committed. I'm actually not sure what she was referring to when she says she became an animal in March. She also, at her trial, was asked who the Messiah is, and she replied, "I am. My mission is to proclaim Christ, to replace religion with Yahweh, to replace law with Yahweh, to replace sanity with Yahweh." She added that she had died 7 times and had been reincarnated each time. She later in the trial testified when she was testifying about the actual acts that occurred the night that she committed the murder, she testified, I began seeing something in front of Shelly Smith. Well, she didn't say this. I began seeing something in front of Shelly. I saw this face, and I saw it was a snake. Yahweh was sending me messages. I could see something at her neck, like scissors or knives. I said to myself, is this the lady I have to do battle with? You see this dog walking across my laundry here? She said to herself, oh, Sirius Black, not on the whites. Not on the whites, you cutie pie. Let's try that last quote from her one more time. When she was recounting the murder, she said, I began seeing something in front of Shelly. I saw this face, and I saw that it was a snake. Yahweh was sending me messages. I could see something at her neck like scissors or knives. I said to myself, is this the lady I have to do battle with? She also, at one point in time, claimed that the members of the jury were four-legged animals, possibly lions. So, that is the story that she told the jury. That is, on the basis of that, her attorneys claimed that, she was not in touch with reality and she should not be found guilty of this crime. The jury had four options of verdicts they could render. So their four options were guilty, not guilty, guilty but mentally ill, or not responsible by reason of insanity at the time of the crime. And guilty but mentally ill and not guilty by reason of insanity are slightly different in that not guilty by reason of insanity is basically the person who committed the crime was so disconnected from reality at the time of the crime that there is no way they could have understood what they were doing was wrong, or the consequences of their actions, or not understood what they were doing at all. An example I think of is like the sleepwalking murders. And again, I'm uncomfortable with the term insanity here. It's just not the one that I am accustomed to using. Then there is guilty but mentally ill, which is basically she's guilty of the crime. She knew that it was illegal. She knew that it was wrong what she was doing, but she's mentally ill, so her sentence should possibly be different. Anyway, those are the four possible findings that the jury was given, and they took 4.5 hours to deliberate, and they found her guilty after 4.5 hours, just straight up guilty of murder, and sentenced her to 40 years in prison for murder, and guilty of burglary, which they sentenced her to 30 years in prison for. Those sentences to be served concurrently, so at the same time, and she would be eligible for parole in 20 years. If you're interested in the legal background, it's interesting to read part of one of the appeals about her burglary conviction, because there's an argument, doesn't really hold water in most places now, but there was an argument made at the time that she couldn't be guilty of burglary because the door was unlocked. And she was sentenced to 40 years for the murder and 30 years for burglary. So she was found guilty of murder and guilty of burglary, sentenced to 40 years and 30 years respectively, to be served concurrently, which means the two sentences would be served at the same time, and after 20 years she would be eligible for parole, which I personally think is a little scary given the nature of the crime and the reasoning behind the crime. So she was sent to prison, but this case, it doesn't end there. She was sent to prison in 1983, but the case still got crazier. There's more crazy. In 1986, there was an appeal And I'm not going to go into huge detail on the 1986 appeal, but I also didn't want to go over it. I get really excited about the legal stuff, and I try not to go overboard in talking about it, because I feel like most people aren't quite as excited about the legal parts of these cases. So in 1986, she based her appeal in part on saying that her confession should have been suppressed. She basically said that because she had initially asked the police officers if she was under arrest and they said no, she said that her confession should have been suppressed, but her confession was many hours later. She had been read her Miranda rights a couple of times. After that, she had signed paperwork affirming that she had been read her Miranda rights, agreeing to her Miranda rights. She had, I won't go into too much detail, but basically, like, from the record, it's really clear that her confession was perfectly legally obtained. Another one of her claims in her appeal, and again, these are not all of the claims from the 1986 appeal, because, you know, unless you're a lawyer or you find some of these precedent-setting things interesting, it just makes the video longer. But one of the other things that she put forth in her appeal was that the letter that they found that she got, that they found in her purse that she had written to her son, she said that was illegally seized, and it wasn't. And she also said that she wasn't mentally competent to stand trial. She based her appeal on saying she hadn't been mentally competent to stand trial. And she cited her testimony where she described the following, and this is the part that her lawyers specifically said in her appeal demonstrated that she hadn't been competent to stand trial, is a point where she described the proceedings. So during the proceedings, she described them during her testimony as it being some form of game in which the attorneys were pawns, that the jury of her peers consisted of four-footed animals, probably lions, and that she was acting for the Messiah, and that the judge's role was to meddle. And the implication there is that the judge's role had been to meddle in basically God's or Yahweh's plan for her. So after her 1986 appeal, or at her 1986 appeal, her request for a rehearing was denied. So then there's still more. In 1998, she sought clemency for the murder. And she just didn't go about it the best way. She sought clemency for the murder, but she said she felt no remorse for what she had done, but that she would not murder again if she was set free. She said, I think it was a test to see if I would be obedient, and I proved that I was. And the contract is finished. So she believed that, you know, she was obedient when she saw the image of the snake, and she committed the crime, and that she's not going to murder again because that contract was done. And that was during a public hearing. She said also, and I like this part even better, I think Yahweh owes me something for bleh. She said, I think Yahweh owes me something this time because of what I did for him. Needless to say, her request for clemency was denied by the governor. In prison, she regularly attended counseling sessions for her mental health, but she refused to take psychotropic or antipsychotic medication, and her delusions persisted throughout her prison sentence. A lot of the articles go into that I read, and the case law, because there's more case law after this. The case law discusses basically how she behaved in prison and how she's generally like a good prisoner and real dedicated to the prison ministry, which maybe that's not the healthiest I'm not a psychiatrist, but I gotta say, it doesn't seem like the best place for someone who thinks that they're getting told by God to kill snake people. Anyway, they said a lot of stuff about her time in prison and how she was like a good prisoner, but I don't know, I just don't feel that moved by her being a good prisoner. Then on June 27th of 2002, it was 1 month before she was supposed to be released from prison. So she was going to get out of prison in like July, end of July, beginning of August 2002. So 1 month before she's supposed to get out of prison, she sent a letter to the Boone County Clerk of Court. And I am going to read a significant part of this letter because it is, I think, important to capture the feel of what was going on. Again, her initial crime was committed in 1982. This is in 2002. It is 20 years later. She mails this letter to the Boone County Clerk of Court, inquiring about the disposition of the hat of the righteous one of Israel. That's what she refers to the hat as throughout the letter. She references her case. It's a very well written letter. She's actually a pretty smart woman. But I'm not going to read the whole letter. It's pretty long. I am still going to read a significant part of it, where she says that the misplacing of the hat of the righteous one of Israel creates a huge public safety menace, as the taxpayers of Tippecanoe County found out on August 2nd, 1998, when their courthouse was bombed on my 16th anniversary. Side note, she calls the 16th anniversary of the day she committed the murder of Shelly Smith as my 16th anniversary, which is a little disturbing. And that day, the courthouse in Tippecanoe County was bombed. So, she says, I recently learned that the people in possession of the hat, are the ones who firebombed the courthouse. They apparently believed that the hat was a plaything and put it on their own heads in jest. This violates the command of Yahweh, the Most High God of the universe, that only the Anointed One may wear the hat. She is the Anointed One. And in looking through the court records and some of the evidence, I discovered that this is like this floppy hat that she used to wear that had like a bunch of stuff on it, a peacock feather, and like she had other stuff tied to it. And she had attached locks of Brian Thornton's hair to it. I'd love to know how she got those locks of hair and like if he was cool with that, because it seems like there were some bad signs before all this went down that maybe Brian Thornton might have been aware of. Anyway, so she goes on to say, for my own protection, I am requesting an affidavit from your office regarding the disposition of the hat. I gotta go get more hangers for my clothes. These are like the extra spare hangers that I use when we have nothing left, but I have some more hangers upstairs. So I'm gonna finish reading this letter and then go grab some more hangers. So she says, she wants an affidavit from the office regarding the disposition of the hat. I have need of proof of where the hat went and who has authorized its removal or destruction, so that I will be exonerated from all blame. The blathering idiot who removed the hat from the Boone County Courthouse can be charged with collusion in the Tippecanoe County firebombing, because giving the hat to an unauthorized person is like giving a gun to a 5-year-old child. I do not, she goes on to say, I do not incidentally believe that the hat was destroyed as that blathering idiot planned. Again, blathering idiot who took the hat. I don't know who this is. The hat is very fair and attractive and fey. Anyone who saw it on the garbage heap would be bound to retrieve it as a Boone souvenir. I can devise a way to get the hat back. If you are willing to put up a reward of several $1,000s and advertise in the right places as I shall direct you. And she goes on, and I can devise a way to get the hat back. If you are willing to put up a reward of several $1,000s and advertise in the right places, as I shall direct you. Also, I will have to identify the hat from photos submitted by the prospective reward seekers. This will require a sting operation and much patience, but it will be worth your time and trouble because the person who comes forward with the hat of the righteous one of Israel will be the Tippecanoe County Courthouse bomber. So she sent that letter on June 26th, I think I had said, of 2002, and on July 28th of 2002, her sentence was due to be completed. I'm gonna go grab those hangers, and we will get to the next time Marcia Heald is in court. Final, the end of the line here. Got the hangers. Let's finish this up. The laundry's almost all folded. So, on July 10th, 2002, so she was supposed to get out July 28th, 2002. On July 10th, 2002, the Indiana Department of Correction filed a petition for involuntary commitment, alleging that Marcia Heald suffers, in the words of the petition, they said, Marcia Heald suffers from a psychiatric disorder, is a danger to herself and others, and is gravely disabled. So there's a psychiatrist named Dr. Payne who testified at a hearing regarding this petition. Dr. Payne testified that that he was concerned that based on his past experiences with Heald, her and her June 27th letter to Boone County Courthouse, that was a sign that she wants to, or he said, quote unquote, wants to take up where she left off in the delusional religious experience. So for these reasons, Dr. Payne recommended that Heald receive inpatient treatment at a psychiatric facility and psychiatric medication, which, as we've already noted, she had to that point refused to take. John Barrett, or Barre, I did not look up how to pronounce his name, another psychiatrist who testified, had known Heald for 12 years at this point when he was testifying, and he saw her twice a week for 8 years when he worked with the prison ministry, and he maintained contact with Heald during the 4 years after his retirement. He testified that a loving and supportive environment would be beneficial to Heald, and that Heald could get that support and need from the Holy Cross Church that he was affiliated with and the prison ministry in Indianapolis, and also testified that if she was transferred to the state facility, the mental hospital in Evansville, for psychotropic treatment, it would be great for him because, let's see, he said, because it is right across the river. She had no other friends or family members that had visited her at all throughout the course of all of these hearings and everything. The court records showed at that point that the only one who had indicated any willingness to visit Heald was this Barrett. So in the end, they decided to commit her to Evansville State Hospital, finding that, especially since there was no one to release her to, there was no one to, watch out for her mental health or take care of her if she was released from prison, aside from this gentleman, this doctor, who was willing to sort of be involved in that process. So she then had, in 2003, in March, she had a commitment appeal. And her attorneys argued that collateral estoppel and insufficient evidence had been presented to have her committed. Now, the case law for her commitment appeal is very interesting and actually set some precedent in the state of Indiana when it was heard by the Indiana Supreme Court. And I am not going to go into detail on that. It talks about the collateral estoppel, which is basically, in layman's terms, they were basically arguing that there had been double jeopardy, that, you know, if they wanted to commit her, they should have found her mentally ill. They should have found her not mentally able to stand trial, or found that she was mentally ill and committed her from the very beginning when she first committed the crime, rather than sending her to prison first. But ultimately, in the long run, the court, the appeals court, the Supreme Court of Indiana basically says, is it the Supreme Court of Indiana? Yeah, Indiana Supreme Court. In the end, the Indiana Supreme Court basically says, you know, that's not the case, that's not what's going on here, we have different reasons, and then they point out that they did indeed have enough evidence to determine that she was a danger to herself and others, and that she was gravely mentally ill. And so she remained committed in Evansville. To my knowledge, she's still there and still living, and is likely to remain there permanently. But I didn't do any digging for like her current status, because it's not a true crime matter at this point, and it's her life. I hope she's getting the treatment that she needs. That this whole thing was absolutely tragic, and I have no desire to try to violate HIPAA and hunt someone down when they're receiving medical treatment. So that is the nutso snake decapitation murder case of Shelly Smith by Marcia Heald that took place in this gorgeous house that I still really want in Lafayette, Indiana. And during the retelling of this case, I've managed to fold and put on hangers 3 entire loads of laundry, and now we're going to poof the remainder into drawers and closets. So poof. So 3 loads of laundry folded and put away. It's been one day and my kids have been out throwing water balloons in the backyard, so probably 3 loads of laundry ready to go again. But I'm Amanda, and this has been a mystery and a mess. If you liked it, please like and subscribe. Please let me know down in the comments what you liked and what you think I could improve upon. Let me know what sort of crazy stories you liked. And if you like to listen to true crime and wild history while you get stuff done, please join me every week as we continue to tackle this mess and talk about some mysteries. Thanks.